asking you to contribute in one other way, and that's word clouds that you've been filling out each day. So if we can, let's have a look at some of your contributions over the course of the week in those word clouds. So there you are, a summary of all those words that you've been submitting to us, and the most popular, the most frequently occurring. I think you can see many of the themes that you've been suggesting and that have come through in the other interventions. But now let's move to our panel. And this morning, our panel is 4 keynote listeners. So in order that we're going to listen to them, first of all, we'll start with Laurence Castaigne from the Council of Young Farmers. Then we'll have Judith Conrad from the German Ministry of Agriculture. Then Kaylee Hart from IEP. And finally, Maura Faro from University of Ireland in Galway. So let's start with Laurence, and I hope you're ready to join us from CEJA. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
And would you like to give us your feedback on workshops 4 and 7, Laurence?
Yeah, absolutely. I would first like to thank the whole ENRD team and facilitators for a successful week of inspiring debates and fruitful discussions on the EU's long-term vision for rural areas. So the overarching vision for rural areas stemming from Workshop 4, which addresses the role of farming and the food production in building resilient rural areas, was one in which food producers will have to meet the food demand of an increasing human population with an expected 9 billion people by 2040, and provide consumer with food supplies complying with even higher social and environmental standards. To secure sustainable income and make the business resilient to crisis, food producers will not only have to adapt to the changing food demand, but also to climate change. Consumers will also have a more central role in defining the food models and products in which they are ready to invest in and consume, while farmers are expected to become more integrated partners in the food chain. Then supply and value chains are also to evolve with a diversity of models to be coexisting. To achieve this vision, it is key to address the general renewal challenge. The rural population, with only 6% of EU farm managers who are under 35. Allowing this future to happen will also require a whole lot of cooperation and facilitation. Cooperation between older and younger generations, as well as between local representatives with decision makers, is also needed to ensure that the needs of rural actors are best understood and acted upon. Then Workshop 4 shed also the light on the need for support and training for food producers, especially small producers, to not only optimize their farming techniques, but also to improve their marketing potential and be effective in the value chain. Efficient and transparent administration is required to best implement the policies targeted at rural communities. There is a strong need to simplify the current framework, reduce the administrative burden, and conduct impact assessment before policy implementation. Finally, for farming to play a positive role in building resilient rural futures, farmers need to become price makers rather than price takers. For this, farmers need to get a fair income for their activity and an increased bargaining power in the food chain. Workshop 6 then focus on how to make rural areas vibrant places to live and work in. It starts from its people and a wish to empower local human capital and change the employment dynamic in rural areas. People need an enabling framework to be empowered. Such framework includes access to broadband, services, and transport, but also socialization possibilities. Solutions to provide rural communities with these elements should derive from forward-looking innovations. Finally, a vibrant rural population, as envisaged by participants to Workshop 6, is an inclusive one, which embraces diversity in society. This diversity is reflected in the governance practices and in equal access to services, transport, and employment for all. Vitalizing rural areas starts with local empowerment and capacity building. For this, it really is key to boost the self-confidence of rural actors. In other words, making them aware how important they are for society and improving the image of rural areas. Social innovation can also play a role in supporting vibrant communities, even in sparsely populated areas or where population is declining. In this sense, local heroes and community champions can be engines of change. Rural areas cannot be vibrant if essential services and mobility facilities are not available. It is necessary to identify most urgent services needed and address these through the use of innovative and forward-looking solutions fit for a rural context. In order to make rural areas vibrant, rural actors need to know what tools are available for them and how to apply for those. For this, support and advisory services are required alongside efficient, fair, and transparent policy framework. Therefore, simplification of procedures, a fair tax system, and impact assessments are needed to allow rural communities to make the best use of EU support to serve their needs. This is it on my side as a brief summary of workshops 4 and 6.
Okay, thank you very much, Laurence. We'll come back to you for some questions, but for now, relax, breathe. A really good summary of everything that came out of the 2 workshops. And just a small reminder, workshop 4 was farming and food production's contribution to building resilient rural areas, and workshop 6, which was vibrant rural areas. And I'll just do the introduction as we go along for the rest of the speakers. Thank you for now, Laurence. So we'll turn to Judith Conrad from the German Ministry of Agriculture. Judith, good morning. You're going to talk to us about workshops 5 and 8. So workshop 5 was strong and dynamic rural-urban partnerships, and workshop 8 was people, policy and practice, proofing and implementing a new rural reality. Good morning, Judith.
Yes, hello, thank you very much. And maybe I'll just start off with how we started this morning, David, because before the meeting started, you asked me, is that Vienna in your bag? And I said, no, that's my birthplace, actually. It's a very small town with less than 20,000 inhabitants. So here's right, my first point, a new appraisal and the effective empowerment of rural areas. We need to raise the awareness of rural areas capital, actually. So what is the value of a decentralized spatial structure? What would be the societal, ecological, and economic costs of a concentration on the mega cities? Rural areas can be competitive in many fields. Think of bioeconomy, green energy, data as the central commodity for the Industry 4.0. Rural development policies must encourage new business models, and it must ensure that the benefits of new developments remain in rural areas. We must definitely change the narrative. Rural areas are not left behind. They are extremely heterogeneous. They must be perceived as equivalent players. My second point is knowledge, information, capacity building, and encouragement. It's good to have a vision. It's better to have data. In order to know where the real challenges are, we need a new rural cartography, the collection and analysis of data. For the territorial agenda, the German presidency elaborated a comprehensive atlas on European spatial development. If you haven't seen that yet, you should definitely have a look at it. It's very interesting. Data should also be generated at a local level, including by citizen science. So the idea of a rural observatory was very much appreciated by many participants. In general, the importance of participation and animation of local communities, for example, via the LIGs, popped up on several occasions. Platforms and networks for generating and disseminating information play a fundamental role. Besides, enabling institutions are needed in order to overcome knowledge and capacity barriers and assist public as well as private entities and citizens. The enabling institutions bring me to my next point. Make the voices of the little ones being heard. Favoring small entities means favoring rural areas. For rural areas, it's the small businesses, the small associations, the small municipalities that matter. The most effective way to support small entities is by reducing red tape and bureaucracy, by simplification. The effective and continuous dialogue with and participation of citizens, especially of young people, is vital. Citizens' councils, public consultations, and then there's the beautiful instrument of the local action groups, of course. We should intensify leaders' successful story and take barriers out of its way. Last not least, in the political chorus of the European Union, we need an amplifier for the voice of the municipalities and regions. The distribution of powers brings me to the next point. Administrative collaboration and coordination. Who and how? Probably everybody agrees that collaboration is extremely important. However, partnerships at a local or regional level, especially rural-urban partnerships, are often being severely misunderstood. Partnerships is not about carrying people from somewhere far away to the cities and vice versa. A true partnership requires a level playing field. If basic functions are being concentrated and expanding tendencies of the cities lead to the irrecoverable loss of valuable arable land, a partnership with the neighboring municipalities might be detrimental for spatial and for environmental balances. Decentralized structures and an active decentralization policy should be a target from EU to regional levels. Rural areas need a strong bargaining position. They need coalitions with other rural areas and not necessarily only with the neighbors. Fruitful partnerships need a sustainable framework, also for cross-border collaboration between or within the member states. Regarding the different policy domains and the aim to reach a more coherent and holistic rural policy, we discussed rural agendas with elements of monitoring and reporting or integrating spatial elements, for example, into the European semester. With the same intention, the Cork Declaration already suggested a rural proofing mechanism. Should rural proofing also refer to the distribution of funds? That is an issue the Committee of Region also deals with. All these instruments need an institutional anchor of some kind, and all have one risk in common: a high operating expenditure. Is it proportionate to its output? Participants agreed that for any of these instruments, a strong political commitment is needed and structures that are independent of electoral cycles. My last point, or rather summary, instruments should be as simple as possible. They should have perceptible effects and be flexible enough to allow tailored solutions. We mustn't forget planning, monitoring, proofing, reporting, collaborating, coordinating. They are very fine, but they are just the tools. They are not the product, and they are extremely time-consuming. New governance bodies, task forces, and participation procedures are fine, but they need to be organized. Keeping instruments and governance mechanisms simple and easily implementable must be a priority. So what is the real substance of our vision? I think it is vital to set substantial, so to say, tangible targets that allow us to see and feel the difference of before and after. And the last comment, no one size fits all. No rural area is like the other. Any instrument must be flexible enough to tailor it to national, regional, and local needs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. As I said to Laurence, we'll come back to you with questions, but great summary, really clear, and some really clear points. So thank you for that. So we now come, I hope you can hear me fine, to Kaylee Hart from the Institute of European Environmental Policy, IEEP. So Kaylee hopefully can join us just now and give us her summary from workshops 1 and 3. and that was green rural areas and fair and inclusive rural areas. First, the test will be, Kaylee, can you hear us and can you speak?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Sorry, I've lost some sound, so I can't hear, but it sounds like you can hear me, so that's a good thing. So yes, thank you for inviting me to feedback from workshops 1 and 3 on green rural futures and fair and inclusive rural futures. I wanted just to start with some keywords that came to me as common to both workshops, and those include things like openness, flexibility, accessibility, empowerment, participation, belonging, trust, and diversity, both of people and of place. So some of the points that I make in relation to each of these workshops actually are common to both. But from the Green Rural Futures workshop 1, some of the key points emerging were that it's really important to empower rural communities to take ownership of the green agenda. They need to have ownership to be able to deliver solutions that take account of the diversity and local distinctiveness of the area. But importantly, to do this, you also have to ensure that they have the education, the expertise, information and advice necessary. So different types of knowledge brokers will be needed to act as drivers of change. But local action can't happen in isolation, and there's still a need for a strong policy framework or frameworks to set the direction of travel, build confidence and encourage investment. And particularly that's important where private investment is required. But these sorts of frameworks need to be sufficiently flexible to allow initiatives to be tailored to local circumstances. And there was a really nice quote that I heard in workshop 1, which was that climate and environmental agreements can be signed in Paris or the United Nations, but they can only be accomplished locally. And finally, from workshop 1, the importance of real engagement with local stakeholders, citizens, communities was stressed, and the need to put governance structures and in place that really integrate local views. The sorts of things that were discussed with things like citizens' councils, cooperatives, participatory budgeting. There are all sorts of frameworks out there that can be used. And that really leads me on to the points that were emerging out of workshop 3, which was the workshop looking at how to make rural areas more fair and inclusive. And in this workshop, a key point was raised about the importance of inclusiveness, accessibility, and flexibility. And the fact that it's really important to build these types of considerations into the way you engage with people, as well as the way that you design policy. And accessibility, I think, initiatives and policies for all people, whether they be parents, children, whether they be migrant workers. You need to build that in and think about accessibility right from the design phase. The point about creating a sense of
Okay, I think we've lost Kaylee. We'll ask her to come back to perhaps those final points. She's obviously having an issue with sound. So we'll move on. We'll come back to Kaylee just shortly. And I'll ask Maura Farrell if she'll make her summary from workshops 2 and 7. So as your reminder, I think that's digitally led, innovative rural futures, and workshop 7 was diverse and resilient rural areas. Maura, nice of you to join us this morning.
David, thank you very, very much. And thanks to you and to all the ENRD team for an absolutely wonderful Rural Vision Week. It's so successful. It's been fantastic. Okay, so in feeding back on workshop 2 to start with, digitally led innovative rural areas, we again had some fantastic ideas from this. But one of the key thinkings, I suppose, is that a vision is the future, and the future really is embedded in digital technology. So if we are to have a digitally led, innovative future in rural areas, the preparation needs to start now, and it must engage people from local community right through to national governments and to the EU Commission. Workshop 2 and the people within it highlighted the basic conditions that are needed for rural digitalisation. And these included, to start with, physical infrastructure. The groundwork must be laid and it must be supported by funding and programmes. We must also have community or human capacity skills. And this includes, for all groups and all ages, training and skills in digitalisation really is essential. We must also have access to technology or technological tools and applications. And these will drive innovation within rural communities, but it must reach all areas from intermediate rural to remote rural. So no community ends up being excluded or marginalised as a result of digitalisation. Workshop members, they also believed that we can reach our digital vision by developing what we suggested was a local digital innovation ecosystems. And these really can include anything or everything, from a community or a digital hub to a fab lab or a co-working space. And these spaces can become rural, digital and social networks of innovation that can create jobs, new businesses, new methods of agriculture, while also retaining youth and energising communities. But in realising this vision, we also need to support this and support drivers of change. And these can be local digital brokers, and these can help to animate and network local actors. Another key point from the workshop revolved around connectedness and how digitalisation can connect rural communities internally, but it can also enable communities to connect rural to urban, national to international. So digital connectivity, it really can facilitate new and emerging ideas, such as digital nomads that were mentioned by somebody from Croatia, or remote working that was mentioned by Ireland, or businesses and services such as e-health and e-education. But in turn, it can also allow rural communities to engage with higher level governance structures. Most importantly, however, is the technological needs of rural communities are led by the community for the community. An idea really, I suppose, in many respects that has been embedded in our 30-year leader programme. But our key message, David, from this workshop really is that digital technology will wait for nobody. So preparation and drive by communities supported by governments is absolutely imperative. So in moving on to work package 7, this was about diverse and resilient rural areas. And I suppose a starting point here is that resilience, it cannot be a state of being for a rural community, but it must be a continuous dynamic process of change. And our vision, therefore, must be that rural communities are better prepared to adapt to change. The vision within the workshop really is to have real and empowered rural communities, communities that are valued and that are valued for their economic, their social and their environmental input, and for their resilience to maintain the rural space. For this kind of resilience, you can maintain this rural space for the people living within the rural area, but also for the people visiting that rural area. Communities, however, that become too focused on specific rural specializations, such as farming or tourism or any other specific industry, these may become fragile, and this can lead to instability in some rural communities. However, the group did suggest that diversity and diversification in rural businesses or agricultural activities within communities, this can build resilience and it can ensure that we adapt to change as it comes forward. So resilient and diverse communities start at the local, it starts at local level, but what makes them resilient is often their connections, their interconnections, their networks within their communities, but as important beyond the rural, their regional connections, their connections within the state and most importantly within the EU. Resilient rural communities now and into the future, they must also be inclusive, and they must be inclusive of newcomers, new entrants into farming, women engaged in agriculture or rural entrepreneurship. And this inclusive environment within a rural setting, this really can build economic and social and cultural advantages to rural areas. And it can build long-term resilience. And this can encourage, I suppose, the retention of our young people in these rural areas. Now, the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic that we're all facing globally at this very time, this can lead to rural instability. However, it can also build resilient communities that don't just bounce back following these crises, but will bounce forward. Resilient communities that have the ability to respond and adapt, for example, by protecting and conserving biodiversity or by guarding the health of their community members. So I suppose, David, just to kind of sum up to have a message from both of my workshops, I really would see that our vision following both of these workshops is to have a valued, empowered and digitally aware rural community that really are innovative, diverse and resilient. So that's the feedback, David, from both of those workshops. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Maura. Really nice message to take away. Like I said before, I'll come back with other messages. Right now, and what a wonderful point you made, Maura, because digital connectivity in rural areas, and we lost Kaylee briefly, but I believe she's now back and can finish off her summary from workshops 1 and 3. Kaylee, are you able to rejoin us?
I think so. I'm going to try without video to see whether that's better. And I was going to say, yes, urban areas and digital connectivity also need some work. I'm not quite sure where you heard me up to. That's the only problem.
You were talking about the role of parents and children, and we were
so
going in and out a little bit.
Sure, no, that's fine. So if I just start from workshops, I think you had my feedback from workshop 1 on green rural futures. So in terms of the fair and inclusive rural futures workshop, it was all about making sure that you design policy with accessibility in mind and thinking about the people and their needs when you're designing policy, making sure policies and initiatives are accessible to all. And in this in terms of this, there's also an important point about creating a sense of belonging. And this came up particularly in rural areas where you have temporary or migrant workers, but that's relevant for everyone in rural communities as well. Involve everyone in the policy making process. The second point from the Fair and Inclusive Rural Futures workshop was about the importance of collecting, sharing and using data. And I think we've heard this from others who have fed back this morning already. This is about particularly looking to collect data where there aren't sufficient data currently. So in this workshop, there was a focus on data on gender equality, for example, in relation to rural entrepreneurship. And it's really important to collect all the data that are needed to inform the design of policies and initiatives on the ground to make sure that they really meet local needs and priorities. So I think that was me coming to the end, David. Sorry that was a bit disjuncted.
That's no problem at all, Kaylee. Thank you for that summary. I think because you came back in at the right point, it was a nice and clear summary. And of course, we'll share these slides, the slides from all the workshops as we have done. But I'm going to cycle round again and come back to a question that I'd like to put to all the panel, which is this. Was there a particular moment, a summary, a quote or an example that struck you during the workshops? And I'd just like to, I'll start with Laurence, if I may, and ask that question to her.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, David, for the question. Well, I don't have a specific quote or point in mind, especially because, input from the different workshops which took place this week is huge. But really, the overarching word for me, a word which I heard a lot during the workshops I attended, is opportunities. Rural areas with their unique features represent a great great potential. Rural areas indeed provide us with food, homes, jobs, and essential ecosystem services. We need to create the optimal conditions for rural communities to best use this potential. That means providing rural people with equal and fair opportunities in their personal, social, educational, and professional development. We just raised now a series of challenges such as demographic change, connectivity indeed, low income levels, limited access to services, but also a wealth of measures and concrete actions to help vitalize rural areas. So let's look ahead and explore innovative, inclusive, and sustainable solutions for rural areas, also in the light of climate and digital transformation, and of course the COVID-19 crisis.
Thank you, Laurence. And then if I can come back again to Judith, the same question. Now I can see the full panel. Judith, same question to you?
Yeah, maybe one central idea that was mentioned several times. It all sums up to the necessity of a political will. That's a quote, so to say, from one of the workshops. And I think that's very true. And it's true for all levels, of course. It's true for the EU level as well as for the local level. If there aren't people with a commitment and being engaged with a clear vision of what they want, then everything else doesn't make sense. And then some other elements or citations I find interesting. Doug O'Brien in the working plenary in the beginning said that, or stressed that data is the most important commodity, and rural areas need to take control and capture the value of the data resources. I found that very clear, very important message. And Emilia Stoimenova said that innovation doesn't necessarily happen in big companies. Innovation is community-led. That was another quote which I really liked. And the one I most liked came from Maciek Krzyzikowski, and he said, "COVID has expanded our ability to imagine things," and I think that's really a central point. Somehow I feel that we are at a turning point, and I'm really hoping that we might be taking advantage of it. And a very nice example for this ability to see things differently was, I think, the Minecraft workshop, which they did in Finland with the youth. What a great idea in order to have youth participating in democratic dialogue. It's always so difficult to imagine how to integrate youth perspectives into the dialogue, and that was a very good example, I think.
Thank you very much, Judith, and thanks for recalling the point that Doug O'Brien made. He did get disconnected as well, but the point about data there, and you made a much better job of Maciek's surname than I did, so I appreciate that. But the point about that he made as well, just good recalling these moments from the week. So I'll come to I'll actually come to Maura next if I can, and just ask that question again. What key moments, key quotes, examples? As I said before, you gave us some earlier, but are there any more?
Yeah, thanks, David. I did actually, Thomas Kuminam from Finland presented on rural youth from the Ruralization Project. And he said, and it really struck a chord with me, he said that there's no one dream and there's certainly no one vision. And if there was one vision, he said it would be abstract and we wouldn't be able to be engaged with it. So he said what we need is thousands of visions that take into account local context. And I think really for me that resonated so well with it epitomizes what we believe rural development to be right across Europe, from a political point of view right down to the local, that rural is all about bottom-up thinking. It's all about people, communities coming together. And I often do think that rural communities have already so many ideas. They've got the ideas about how to regenerate their community, how to invigorate or how to digitally enhance their community, but they need support. They need the support. They need what all of the other people have just spoken about this morning. They need governance, they need programs, they need policy. So they need people to facilitate what they already know and what they already can do and what they can bring to their community. So I think communities have the vision They just need to be assisted in doing that. But we need to make sure that this vision is a bottom-up vision. It's the vision that people, because this is the only way we can sustain and maintain that vision if it comes from the people within those communities.
Okay, thank you very much, Maura. And Kaylee, last of all, a key summary quote.
Yeah. Well, the quote that struck me, and it was somebody was saying that we're redesigning the dynamics between the centre and the periphery from a situation where rural has always been on the periphery, exporting population, low value, unprocessed products to the centre. But in the green transition, we're actually redefining that. In fact, the green agenda allows rural areas to become more centre.
I think we've lost the audio, I'm afraid, from Kaylee. We'll try and come. Oh, no, there you are.
Sorry, is this
just a broken signal? Yeah.
Sorry. So seeing the green as a positive.
Yeah. No, and we've lost the audio, so we'll come back to that because Kaylee was just about saying about seeing the green as a positive, a reminder of that when she's able to rejoin us. So I've asked for questions from the chat. Statements are great, but questions are even better. So if you have any for the panel, they're willing, they've said, to be surprised by questions. But here's one that's less surprising because I did brief them on it. What are the key themes from the workshops that for you, specifically you individually, must be included in the Rural Vision communication? What's the most urgent to start now to reach where we want to be in 2040? So perhaps, again, we'll start with Laurence again.
Sure, that's a very good question again. There are three key themes that emanated from the workshops I reported on. First, capacity building. Second, participation. And third, efficiency. Well, there is a need to develop capacity building at the local level to get initiatives started and to keep momentum, really. There is large capacity within rural communities for mutual social support. There are indeed willing volunteers over there. There is local knowledge, but often those people, they need support. That means support in terms of animation, coaching, helping them with any organizational or administrative stuff, expenses. Then participation. By participation, I understand building bridges and involving marginalized groups. That includes migrants, disabled people, women, elderly, and youth in the rural life. How can this be supported? Well, for example, by facilitating access or establishing a level playing field for equality of participation, supporting those people in communities who may have less capacity, such as poor or smaller municipalities, small and remote villages. I would like also to put a special emphasis on young people. There should really be special incentives and support made available to them as a representative future, and they can be a great drivers for change to revitalize indeed rural areas. Then I'm referring with the word efficiency to an efficient and transparent policy framework. I already mentioned it in my summary of workshops 4 and 6. But indeed, public administration and procedures need to be reviewed with the goal of creating an enabling framework for rural communities that can mean reducing red tape, creating synergies between the different EU funds, simplifying procedures. There's also a need to be transparent on the impact of EU policies. I'll take the example of farming by indeed, for example, conducting impact assessments on trade agreements. So it is about making the life of rural actors easier so that they have more time to develop their economic activity and ensure their well-being.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll come back then to Judith and ask the same thing. What must go into the Rural Vision communication? What's the most urgent aspect?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to stress and support everything Laurence said, because all these issues with participation, engagement, knowledge, information, enabling institutions, networking, that's something that always comes up in all of or came up in all of the workshops, and it's really important. How can we best do that? Well, it may sound a bit boring if I come back to that point, but digitalization, I mean, that's just so extremely important for all aspects we're tackling here, that I think you can't mention it often enough. And of course, physical infrastructure, I think, is very much needed and or to say the essential basis for everything. But I think there are many things on their way already in regard to physical infrastructure. I think there have been some years for bringing things on their way, and we are on our way, I think, with the infrastructure. But however, what comes now, I think, is the digital ecosystem, the platforms. I think there's an urgent need to put up viable ecosystems in order to enable people to cooperate, to inform, to disseminate knowledge. And then data, of course, is an extremely important element. The observatory, I think, is a good suggestion, including to use it for monitoring purposes. I mean, rather than formal reporting mechanisms, which are extremely costly, so to say, in a personal manner. These monitoring done by scientists or by people from an observatory, could prove much more valuable. And then I'd like to reiterate what Laurence also said about bureaucracy. I mean, we can't really underestimate bureaucracy barriers and their importance for rural regions. It's the COVID crisis, I think, has also shown that Europe has got severe structural problems in this, specifically in this aspect. We are very slow with our procedures. We are very bureaucratic, but also very serious in what we're doing, but that sometimes makes us very slow. So that must be tackled as soon as possible in all aspects. I think that's the basic point.
Thank you very much, Judith. It's interesting because we had a comment or a question that was put about how do we get a flexible programming, a flexible policy framework, which is a question that we can maybe take into the point with the Commission when we come back to it later. I'll just allow Maura first and then Kaylee just to address this point about what should go into the Rural Vision communication. Maura.
David, yes, I think, I suppose, as well, reiterating everything that the previous speakers have already said, but I suppose definitely thinking of digitalization, we do need that physical infrastructure and we do need the human capacity and the access to tools and applications. I think that's a starting point for every innovative kind of thinking within a rural community. And I suppose we have had a lot of policy innovative kind of thinking in and around rolling out broadband systems within different countries. And I suppose the issue with digitalization, it moves so rapidly and moves so quickly that by the time we actually get some of these things rolled out, we are already behind the curve. So I think the rapidness of doing this, of rolling out digitalization, is absolutely essential. In many respects, I think resilient communities are built from everything we have talked about. They're built from all of the ideas of connectedness, interconnections, even the idea of simplifying the bureaucracy in and around programs and policies, allowing communities to access these programs, allowing it to become much easier for people to get engaged in these policies and practices. I think that's hugely important. And I think keeping in mind that a lot of the time within rural communities, there is volunteer workers that are engaged in this type of a drive in rural communities. So to support them, we need those local I suppose, digital brokers. We need local entrepreneurs. We need rural development officers within these rural communities. And I suppose the last point that I'd like to make is a resilient community really is about bouncing forward. We cannot just come back from a crisis. We have to move a step forward every time. And really, I think we will not have that resilient and innovative and interconnected community unless we can bounce forward from a crisis rather than just bounce back.
Okay, and Kaylee, I'll come to you. There's a small articulation, perhaps, so you can consider just as I'm coming to Kaylee, which is one question that came from James Ehrlich in the chat, which are what are the concrete steps for changing policies to encourage new regenerative and resilient development in rural and peri-urban areas? Just something for you to think about. I may ask our last comment. You can just show me who's interested in answering that. But Kaylee, just in terms of the points to put into the Rural Vision communication first. If I have, Kaylee.
Yes, thank you, Dave. I'll try and be brief in case my connection disappears again.
No problem.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I think we're struggling with your connection again, Kaylee.
Yes. Great. Hopefully my internet connection is back again. To raise was that in addition to all the others that have been made already, is that we need to make sure that a diverse, resilient and healthy environment is a central element of any strategy to enhance the social and economic vibrancy of rural areas. This is important just for quality of life, but a healthy environment is also really important for economic development, addressing climate change issues, as well as addressing issues of sustainable food and timber and fibre production. And I think the point I wanted to make was that if we don't do this, then everyone's affected, not just people in rural areas, but people in urban areas as well. And we really have to take this opportunity now to make a break with the status quo and make the step changes that are needed to really deliver for the environment and for climate.
Thank you very much, Kaylee. Yeah, I think we got your message through in the end. So just that last point again, just quickly for the panel, concrete steps that we can take to change policy to create resilient and regenerative rural areas. Any quick comments on that? Anyone like to?
Yeah. David, I'll just come in there. I think one of the key things for me is out of this week, this has been a fantastic European week, but we must make sure that this transfers to national governments right across Europe. I think that's absolutely imperative. It's wonderful to have such a fantastic like-minded group of people engaged in what we're talking about here. And the drive from the European Commission is absolutely imperative, but we need national governments to come on board as well and take all of these actions. It is within a national government that the policies and practice are often initiated. And I think unless national governments take on the drive from here, then a lot of the work starts to fall down. So really the concrete step is to make sure, first of all, that we get the support from national governments. Communities are often ready. We just need the support from the national government. And the drive is there from Europe. So we need to take that forward.
Okay, that's a great answer. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to stop there, but just to say thank you. Apologies for Kaylee's connection, but Laurence, Judith, Maura, great responses, great summaries from everything that's happened this week. So relax, let's take those messages on to some of the other institutions now and to the European Commission for the rest of this morning's sessions. Thank you for now. So before we move to the second panel this morning, just a quick reminder, because we started this week by getting testimonials from rural areas, and we're going to just move, before we bring in the new panel, back to some of those videos and the testimonials that came from across the EU.
Hi, I'm Vedrana Poletar from Croatia. This is my farm, which is co-financed from Croatian RDP Measure 6. I believe that by 2040 we will have many more young farmers because we are the future. This is my rural.
Hi everyone, this is Aris from Peloponnese Grace. Rural Europe will always be a place that everyone wants to visit, now and in 2040 and beyond. This is my rural.
I'm Cristina from Zona Media in Navarra, Spain, a rural area with a rich heritage. I hope that in 2040, people living and working in rural Europe can decide about our future. This is my rural.
Ahojte, moje meno je Andrea, pochádzam zo Slovenska a toto je náš vidiek plný krásnej prírody a potenciálneho pôdohospodárstve. Do roku 2040 ľudia vyrastajúci v mestských oblastiach pochopia, ako veľmi vidiek potrebujú, aký je užitočný a úžasný.
Well, just a quick reminder of some of those messages, those inspiring messages from rural areas and reflection of what their rural is. So I've now got a new panel, and this time from 3 European institutions. From the European Parliament, I have Mazali Aguilar, MEP. From the Committee of the Regions, I have Enda Stenson. And from the European Economic and Social Committee, I have Peter Schmidt. Thank you to all 3 of you for joining me today. Now, first of all, the first perspective I've asked the panel to think about is reflecting on the work that they've been doing. What are the exchanges that have been happening in the institutions? What are the priorities which most concern you for 2040? I'll come to first to Mazali Aguilar, please. And I think she's going to speak to us in Spanish.
Pues muy buenos días a todos desde Madrid y muchísimas gracias en nombre del Parlamento Europeo por contar con nosotros en esta iniciativa tan sumamente importante para que juntos podamos diseñar los instrumentos y llevar a buen puerto el éxito de nuestras zonas rurales. Durante toda esta semana, muchos oradores han repetido que el mundo rural en la Unión Europea es muy diverso y muy heterogéneo y que, por tanto, nos enfrentamos ante situaciones bien diferentes que requieren, a su vez, políticas muy diferentes. Yo diría que no solo es eso. Los problemas son tremendamente complejos y, desgraciadamente, no hay soluciones simples. En uno de los grupos de trabajo de esta semana se hablaba de un hecho fundamental, cómo integrar en las políticas la gran diversidad de nuestro medio rural, y yo creo que ese debe ser precisamente el punto de partida. En algunas zonas de la Unión Europea es realmente alarmante la despoblación del mundo rural y el abandono paulatino de la agricultura debido precisamente a la falta de rentabilidad. Y como ha señalado la representante de CEJA, a la falta de renovación generacional. Hay que repetir la cifra, que es realmente terrible. Menos del 6% de los agricultores son menores de 35 años y estas cifras todavía son incluso menores en países como Portugal o el mío, España. El debate esta semana ha vuelto a incidir en la importancia de la agricultura como motor de la economía rural y muchos, yo creo que han puesto muy acertadamente el acento en la necesidad de diversificar las actividades económicas en el medio rural y para ello hay que mejorar previamente las infraestructuras y, por supuesto, los servicios públicos. En todos los grupos de trabajo, según hemos escuchado en las conclusiones, se ha repetido una idea que para mí es absolutamente clave. Los instrumentos para mejorar la competitividad del medio rural deben ser muy simples y muy flexibles. Coincido con las conclusiones de la representante del Ministerio alemán, que dice que aunque muchas veces somos muy bien intencionados en las políticas o en los instrumentos, a veces estas cosas terminan generando mucha más burocracia, mucho más rechazo y mucho más desconocimiento. Yo creo que lo que hay que hacer es invertir en la accesibilidad a esos instrumentos y cambiar radicalmente la percepción que tenemos de ellos. En estos momentos yo creo que tenemos los datos, tenemos las cifras, tenemos el diagnóstico correcto de las carencias y las potencialidades del medio rural. Ahora lo que hay que hacer es implementar esas políticas de una manera mucho más ambiciosa y mucho más coordinada, de forma que se puedan aprovechar el punto de inflexión que hemos tenido y que supone la pandemia respecto a lo que nosotros pretendemos y la concepción que tenemos del mundo rural. Yo creo que este es el momento de encontrar los incentivos y, con palabras mayores y con letras grandes, invertir para que los ciudadanos puedan ver en nuestros pueblos oportunidades de desarrollo económico y, por supuesto, familiar. Y, por último, me gustaría apoyar a todas las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, sobre todo del ámbito local, que reclaman más y mejor diálogo con las autoridades, y recordar que el Parlamento Europeo exige que el reto demográfico esté presente en el conjunto de políticas de la Unión Europea para poder abordar de manera muchísimo más coordinada y, como se dice en Bruselas y se ha repetido mucho esta semana, holísticamente. Así que muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much for that, Masli Aguilar. Very interesting points you made. Unfortunately, I was getting the interpretation coming through very clearly. So just before I come with a question, perhaps, I'm going to ask Enda Stenson from the Committee of the Regions if he'd like to join us now. And the same proposal, really the same question to Enda.
Okay, good morning, and thank you so much for having me here. And you're all very welcome to. I'm speaking to you from the beautiful west coast of Ireland. No nicer place to be during this pandemic and to be isolated here. Anyway, as the rapporteur for the Committee of the Regions on EU strategy for rural revival, which was adopted in December last year, I am particularly delighted to attend this working plenary session of the Rural Vision Week. And among the many challenges that have been identified for the future of Europe, a better territorial balance is, of course, a central concern for the Committee of the Regions. We are concerned to note that there is a significant development lag between the urban and the rural areas. Poverty is more pronounced in rural areas than it is in urban areas. And there is a huge sense of abandonment in rural areas. And this translates into the growing Euroscepticism in these areas. And faced with these alarming findings, we have tirelessly requested a European rural agenda since 2016. The European Parliament has supported us on a resolution which was voted on the 3rd of October 2018, asking for the European Commission to implement the European Rural Agenda. And thanks to this, the European Commission will soon adopt a communication on the long-term strategy for rural areas. We welcome this issue. We believe that today more than ever, a rural agenda is currently needed in rural areas as a result of the COVID-19 crisis that we are in the midst of at the moment. Unfortunately, and this is sad, but the vision will be adopted too late to be taken into account in the regulations on structural funds that we are currently being adopted for the implementation of the recovery plans. But we don't have time to wait for the publication of this vision, and we should act now on several fronts to facilitate and speed up the development of rural areas without waiting for the next programming period. The first front in the recovery plans should be the core, and we are concerned in the Committee of Regions that in particular rural regions are not sufficiently involved in the decision-making with regards to the elaboration of the national recovery and resilient plans in the majority of the member states. Rural areas may be allocated less by the next generation EU funds due to structural framework of national recovery and resilient plans for their priorities for action and implementation methods, despite rural regions having been hit particularly hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. Rural proofing should apply now for the recovery plans. The second front is the empowerment of rural communities. If European policies are not based on the regions, if they do not grant these areas sufficient resources to develop their own policies and experiments, then we will not achieve the results that we want and that we need and that we expect. Local and regional authority representatives say that they must, and that includes us all, that we must not be pushed out of CAP management and delivery, and the delivery of them. On the 23rd of October, the European Parliament supported our proposal amendment enabling regions to continue playing their role as rural development management authorities, and more generally, their role in the preparation and management of future common agricultural policy strategic plans. We urge and we need the Council and the Commission to fall in with their proposals set out in the European Parliament's position on the National Strategic Plan regulation. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure that that'll raise some questions, perhaps in the chat, or we'll come back to you for more detail, perhaps, about mobilising rural stakeholders later on. But thank you for those points just now. So our third intervention is from Peter Schmidt from the European Economic and Social Committee, and I think Peter's managed to join us, and I'll hand over to you just now. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thanks my previous speakers. It makes it easier for me, because a lot of what has been said is also the position of the ESC. So, you know, the ESC is the House of the Civil Society. We organize with the stakeholders, with all the stakeholders, employers, trade unions, and others, common positions. And recently, on the 8th of March, we had a debate in our NAT section exactly on that point. And there have been raised a lot of points and a lot of issues. I want to pick out of these three what we think are necessary points in order to contribute to this week, to this important week. Firstly, we say that we have to make the rural areas an attractive place, as the previous speakers already mentioned, and we have to involve, in order to do that, a lot of actors into this. So what we have to understand is that the believing into the free market, the believing into the market will regulate everything, that we understand this was the wrong approach. This has led to the situation that basic services are no longer in the rural areas. We have to recognize that. So this is basic services on education, on public transport, on digitalization, on health, and so on. This is a result of a lack of regulation, a lack of an active policy in this region. So what we would need is a well-being economy, which is based on participation, and this is there is a huge potential for job creation. Secondly, we think that the rural areas, they can be a key actor in achieving the sustainable development goals of the UN, in achieving the targets of the European Green Deal, when we talk about biodiversity, when we talk about different other environmental and social aspects. So, but for that, we need a holistic approach, because these projects are holistic projects, and when we do not take the chance to create holistic projects on the rural area, we will not come to a well-being economy in this. So for this, we must overcome the traditional approach. The traditional approach was focused on agriculture, was food production. These are all correct approaches, but now we have to extend these traditional approaches in the development, in developing tourism, sustainable tourism, having an industrial policy. We need an industrial policy for the rural area. So, and we lost really a lot of good quality jobs in this area because of the recent politics. Give an example. We can imagine that we introduce, for instance, food councils on the local level, food councils which organize the food supply chain. This would help the food security, and it would bring additional quality jobs into the rural area. Thirdly, and last point, we need better access to funding. So we know that this is quite difficult when we have small projects, and the European Commission and the member states as well have projects, but they are not really tailored for small projects. They are more tailored for big projects, and that's why we think these are necessary steps. Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. I've got a follow-up question, and I think we'll probably have one or perhaps two questions from the chat to put across to all three of my speakers. But a question for all three is, what role can a vision for the future of our rural areas drawn up at a European level play in changing the narrative of our rural areas? How can it help mobilise and involve mobile stakeholders and citizens to see it realised? I can articulate further on that, but I was going to come first to Masli Aguilar if she is still online. I'm not seeing her right now, but if not, perhaps I can come to Enda Stenson on that question.
Aquí sigo.
She is there. There you are.
Bueno, vamos a ver, es muy importante esta pregunta. Yo diría, desde nuestro punto de vista, la nueva visión de la Comisión Europea sobre el futuro del medio rural, yo creo que llegará en el momento apropiado, en el momento oportuno, cuando estamos reformando nuestras políticas y las prioridades a raíz de lo que la pandemia nos ha enseñado a todos nosotros. El Pacto Verde, que es muy ambicioso y para ser creíble, yo creo que necesita tomarse los aspectos demográficos y fundamentalmente la despoblación de nuestro medio rural muy en serio. Y yo creo que esa tiene que ser una de las grandes prioridades con el fin de que la actuación de la Unión Europea realmente sea lo más efectiva posible. Creo también que hay que revisar las políticas y los instrumentos que son necesarios para hacer un diagnóstico perfecto, equilibrado, un análisis que sea realmente valioso. Y no es la primera vez que se hace un buen análisis de los problemas, pero ahora es el momento de actuar. Es el momento de actuar, de ponerse a ello, de trabajar duro. Parece que hay una nueva ambición política para mejorar nuestro medio rural. Ese es el primer paso, pero solo el primer paso. Esta ambición debe venir acompañada también de una colaboración, a mi juicio, real y efectiva con la sociedad civil organizada, con las ONGs, con las asociaciones de agricultores, de consumidores, las cooperativas, es decir, todos aquellos que amamos el mundo rural. Y es verdad que el Parlamento apoya plenamente todos los informes que en los últimos años se han ido elaborando y ha elaborado el Comité Económico y Social en relación con el medio rural y esta necesaria implicación de todos los actores. Pero no solo se trata de participar en la implementación de estas políticas, sino también en la fase previa, en la fase de diseño y cómo se hay que concepcionar los nuevos instrumentos. A ver, yo creo que no podemos pasar por alto la necesidad de comunicar de una manera muy fácil sobre las necesidades que realmente tiene el medio rural, como aquí acabamos de decir, y hay que sensibilizar a los ciudadanos, los más urbanitas, los que vivimos en las ciudades, que realmente nos enfrentamos a unos grandes desafíos, que el declive del medio rural en zonas mediterráneas, por ejemplo, acarrea unas gravísimas consecuencias medioambientales y, por supuesto, económicas y sociales. Yo creo sinceramente que existe un desconocimiento tremendamente grande, muy grande, desgraciadamente, sobre la actividad agrícola y ganadera y ello propicia que la visión que estemos dando sea falsa y está desenfocada con la realidad y eso no ayuda en absoluto a articular los instrumentos que necesitamos para facilitar el desarrollo de una economía local sostenible. Y aquí me callo. Gracias.
Thank you very much to Masli Aguilar. So Enda Stenson, perhaps bringing you in the same point. And you're on mute, I'm afraid. It's one of those phrases we use.
Sorry, that's okay. I can you hear me now? I think so. Yeah.
Perfectly.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I can't add a lot more. As already mentioned, like before the empowerment of the rural communities, it is essential to achieve territorial cohesion goal. A shared European vision could help involve stakeholders at all levels of governance, but it will be useless if the rural development policy is nationalised. The Committee of the Regions, and also in the Committee of the Regions, and we've worked hard on this, we call for the regions to play a prominent role in the government of strategic plans, including the second pillar regions. This regional management, as close as possible to the field, ensures that the problems of certain areas that are left behind are better taken into account. And that must be done. And in order to achieve results, regional elected representatives must be mobilised by involving them, since it is not with administration instruction that things are taken forward on the ground, but through strong political will. And we need strong political will in the European Community to bring this forward. That's my view on that. It's essential that happens.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Enda Stenson. And Peter Schmidt, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, as I've already said, I mean, the European approach plays a critical role, because in order to design, the projects and my personal point of view is the future of Europe will be decided on the rural areas, because it's quite unfair that people, I live in the rural areas, that people pay the same tax like people living in the urban areas, but the service is different. And that's why we must bring the urban and the rural projects together. We must think this together. Before we don't do that, we will not come to a proper approach in the rural areas. That means we must have bottom-up approaches in both sides and bringing this together. Secondly, we must build a narrative that there is a high quality of life in the rural areas. I don't want to say it's a higher quality of life, but if we would have on the rural areas all this what we have in the cities, meaning on the cultural or another diversity, so this would bring more, let me say, attractivity into this area. So the European approach, and we appreciate that the Commission is taking the initiative for that, is placed really a key role. The second point, David, if you allow, is Europe must protect their people living in Europe, and for that we must change the industrial policy as well, as I said. So we must have an industrial policy which is also focused on the rural area, and not again to believe in the free market. There's a famous example in the sugar beet sector. So we lifted the quotas years ago. All trade unions, employers, civil society said this is a wrong approach because we will lose jobs, quality jobs on the rural areas. So, but in Europe we did. And I think we must really revise our thinking in it in order to bring more jobs, more quality jobs on the rural areas.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. So we've got a few questions that are coming in through the chat. I'm going to open it up and just see who would like to respond to them, because this is really two questions put together, because what's been put across is the importance of digital connectivity as a basic service for rural areas. But combined with that, how to make sure that the skills and education goes alongside it for people to be able to use those digital means. Would anyone like to respond to that?
Well, I just want to say from the west of Ireland, I had to travel, say, 8 miles to come into the beautiful hive here in Carrigan-Shannon to come on this call this morning. I live in rural Ireland. We do not have the broadband. We do not have the connectivity. And that is an essential role. It has never been more noticeable than throughout this pandemic, where people were expected to work from home. Virtually impossible for me to work from home because we have not, and as has been rightly pointed out, we pay the same taxes. We do everything that is expected of us, but we are not given, and the same facilities are not rolled out to rural areas as has been right across the urban divide. And that is critical to this whole conversation, that we are entitled right across rural Europe to the same expectations that they have in the urban areas. I just want to put that point across. And at the moment, it is not fair. And if the Urban Commission do not step up to the mark, they are leaving the rural areas behind. They will soon be forgotten. And we cannot, and this generation would never be forgiven if that is allowed to happen.
Okay, thank you very much, Enda Stenson. Anyone else like to bring any other further comments on that? Because we've got other questions. Please.
A ver, simplemente me gustaría incidir y apoyar exactamente lo que mi colega acaba de decir. Yo creo que si lo que pretendemos es crear nuevas oportunidades laborales en el medio rural, es absolutamente imprescindible que mejoren 2 cosas bajo mi punto de vista. La infraestructura de la banda ancha, como bien se acaba de apuntar aquí, y la mejora de la red en el transporte. Es decir, yo creo que antes de nada lo que hay que abordar es los problemas estructurales que son, a nuestro juicio, la causa principal del éxodo rural a la ciudad. sin estos, digamos, apoyos de transporte e infraestructura de banda ancha, nuestros jóvenes no van a querer ir al campo. No, hay otras infraestructuras y los colegios, los hospitales, es decir, la cultura, lo que se acaba de mencionar aquí. Si pretendemos que nuestros jóvenes que aman el campo, y yo sé que lo aman ciertamente, y seguir con los negocios que han tenido sus padres, sus abuelos, sus antepasados, o realmente nos ponemos a ello y les damos digamos, un escenario amable, o no van a volver al campo, porque para ellos es tremendamente difícil. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And Peter, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just fully agree. I mean, to be concrete, why we do not use now the recovery funds in order to bring this money to the rural areas and build up infrastructure, as mentioned by Enda and Masali. I think this is a concrete point, and I'm not that confident that this will come, because we will spend the money in the big projects rather than in the projects of the municipalities and in the rural areas. So this would be necessary, really having a plan. That's why we talk about a holistic approach, having a plan on the development of schools, on the development of transport, on the development of digitalization. And for that, we can introduce with some tools a better life and a fairer life, as we said in this area.
Okay, thank you very much to all the panelists. I've got one, and it's really, we're getting lots of questions coming through. We're trying to capture all of them as best we can. I'm trying to make them simple enough for me to understand so that I can put them across to you. But one point which is really merging several questions, this is the final question I'll put to you. So any other points you want to make, please put in there. It's how to strengthen the financial situation of rural areas. What innovative arrangements or instruments could be used?
Okay, so I start, and I'm sure that Enda and Masali will add this. So how to improve the financial situation for the municipalities or the rural areas? I mean, this is a question of taxation. We have to be honest in the taxation. That's a question of distribution. When we have a look into the money, what is around in Europe, then we have to confess there is enough money. There is enough money. So the question is, how is it distributed? First point. Second point, we have to clarify that, as Enda already mentioned, and that's clear, we pay the same tax. And I'm not sure that everybody is paying the same tax when it comes for the rich people. So we could tax them also more in order to distribute it to the rural areas. So this would be quite easy. But the lobby is too huge for that. And that's why we need all actors in order to counter this, because money is there, but it is wrong distributed.
Okay. Enda, I think you're going to intervene.
Yeah, I can only concur with what Peter has said, and it can be very upsetting and annoying, but you cannot let that overcome everything. We do everything, and it has been rightly pointed out, we need the infrastructure. It's not a case of money. The money is there. It's how it is used. And we have got to look at that. And I just want to say, in spite of the goal of the territorial cohesion enshrined in the Treaty of Lisbon, we know that the European support for rural areas has fallen sharply, and that's correct. And that the European structural and investment funds could be used a lot more effectively to reduce the inequalities that has happened. And there's nothing that's hidden here. This is very straightforward. The funds are there. It's how they are spent and how they are used. And going forward, we need to put the proper perspectives in place for this. Hopefully, that is all that I have to add today. We could continue most of the day on about this and the rural divide. There's an awful lot that we could say, but there's an awful lot that everybody knows and that are not putting this into use. And hopefully, meetings like this and this week will bring this to fruition. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And Masali, any last reflections?
Sí, yo quería ahondar en una preocupación que para mí es fundamental. Yo soy economista y para mí es importante hablar de rentabilidad de las explotaciones agrícolas y ganaderas, que con frecuencia, y yo creo que todos mis colegas lo saben y las personas que nos estarán escuchando, desgraciadamente están vendiendo sus productos por debajo de los costes de producción y así no hay manera de hacer una explotación rentable. Y si no es rentable, no es sostenible. Y digamos que no estamos tratando a nuestros agricultores y ganaderos de la mejor manera posible porque la normativa va increciendo, se les exigen unos objetivos medioambientales que en la mayoría de los casos eso requiere unas nuevas inversiones. Y si ya de por sí los márgenes que tienen de maniobra son muy escasos, con esa nueva normativa, todavía esos márgenes de maniobra, esos márgenes de beneficio se empequeñecen y se hacen todavía muchos más cortos. Con lo cual, se está abandonando la agricultura, entre otras cosas, porque no es sostenible esas explotaciones. Y ya, simplemente un pequeño apunte. Y si encima estamos pensando en esos acuerdos de la Unión Europea con terceros países, donde realmente entran productos de otros países que ni siquiera están, cumplen la normativa tan exigente que a nuestros agricultores y ganaderos se les están exigiendo, pues todavía estamos hablando de una competencia desleal. De modo que, insisto, si las explotaciones agrarias no son rentables, no son sostenibles. Fondos hay, pero hay que ayudarles a que efectivamente esa sostenibilidad sea patente y esa rentabilidad sí, para que nuestra gente no abandone el campo. Muchas gracias.
Okay, well, at that, I want to say thank you to all my panel for their input, some strong points, some interesting points that have been put across. I certainly appreciate the input you all gave from your different perspectives. So to Masli Aguilar, to Enda Stenson, to Peter Schmidt, thank you very much for participating this morning. As I've said to everyone, all your voices have been heard all the way through this morning and through this process. So thanks once again. So that for us, thank you, that for us wraps up the working plenary. I've been saying about contributions, just a few points just to illustrate how much you've been getting involved. We've had over 6,200 unique visits to the Rural Vision Week site. We've had 3,374 unique visits to the marketplace. And the Rural Inspiration Award yesterday had 4,315 unique page views. So you're getting involved, keep getting involved. We can't answer all the questions, but we're taking note of them. We're going to wrap up the closing working plenary just now. But at this point, I will remind you that not very long from now, in only 20 minutes, we'll have the high-level plenary starting with the commissioners participating. So come back, join us then, and we'll continue this conversation and we'll come to the end of Rural Vision Week. Thank you very much. Welcome back if you're rejoining us, or good morning if you're joining us for this, the final session of Rural Vision Week. So we're on day 5. We've had a week-long set of activities, starting with the opening working plenary and high-level plenary, and this is the closing high-level plenary. We'll have shortly a summary from Enrique Gasalado, who is head of the Regional and Rural Policy Unit at the OECD. And then we'll be having a panel session with the 3 commissioners, with interventions from all 3 of them that have been involved since the outset in the long-term vision for rural areas. And those are, of course, Commissioner Wojciechowski, Commissioner for Agriculture, Vice President Dubravka Suica for Democracy and Demography, and Elisa Ferreira, the European Commissioner for Cohesion and Reforms. We'll get to them and we'll invite them to join us very, very soon. A reminder to you all to get involved as much as you can. You can get involved through the chat. We just had our working plenary session where we heard from 4 keynote listeners who gave us a really good summary of the 8 workshops that took place on day 2 and day 3. And we had some input from the European institutions about some of their political messages of what they see as needing to be involved in the long-term vision. But you can be involved. You can still be involved on Twitter using the hashtag #RuralVision2040 and Rural Vision EU, and also get involved through the chat and the comments. Our reminder, give me questions in advance as much as you can and keep the questions quite simple. And of course, we'll only be able to reflect on questions, not on statements that you might want to make. But let's not delay things any further. I want to introduce, to give us his feedback from really the whole week and the overall input to this session, to Enrique Gasalado. As I said, he is head of regional and rural policy at the OECD. Enrique, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, David.
And I think you have a summary and a PowerPoint of a presentation that you'd like to make on the various points that you've picked up on, reflected on during the whole week of activities.
Yes, indeed, David. While we put the presentation on screen, I'd like to congratulate the European Network for Rural Development really on putting this through. I think it's been very interesting sessions, a lot of rich discussions. I'd also like to congratulate the Commission for pursuing this long-term vision. I think it's the right path to go. And now I have to summarize all that richness into a 10-minute presentation, which is not an easy task, but I'll give it my best. And I think on my presentation, I'll focus on 3 areas. The first one is about the vision, some common threads that I've picked up. The second part is about what to do, in terms of what the discussions were trying to get towards that vision. And then the third part, some of my reflections on some of these elements. So let's jump straight into the first to the next slide. So I guess the first thing that came out, and a lot of these discussions, was this need for rural policies to be holistic. There was a lot of discussion around moving beyond the traditional agricultural domain, but also thinking about services, entrepreneurship, innovation, digitalization. These kinds of things, it calls for like a more holistic policy that needs to be taken into account in this long-term vision. The second part that we heard a lot of, it was about the diversity of places. And I think it was quite nice to see the videos and to show all the different types of rural places that exist in Europe. And this is quite important because oftentimes, the rural tends to be considered a non-metro. And in fact, there's many diversity of rural. So we need to have tailor-made responses for the different types of rural that have different characteristics and different needs. I think the third item that came up is this need for the strategy to be shaped to bottom-up processes and local communities. And I think that was also mentioned in the commissioner, the president's speech, that the vision cannot come from Brussels. It needs to be shaped by the actual places themselves. So there needs to be this bottom-up process to hear about the vision. And then we also heard about, it's not just about development, but it's also about inclusion. And this needs to be participatory and engage with vulnerable communities, women, minorities, and so forth. Something that struck me on this session was, for example, there was a study that was done that the traditional agriculture policy had benefited about 90% of men. So it's also thinking about, diversity and impact that you might have on this vision. Next slide, please. Then there's a lot of discussions about how to break the isolation of some of these rural communities and work towards this open rural community framework. And here it's interesting to hear about the need for urban and rural partnerships and linkages. So we need a vision that has a coherence and has a positive elements with the urban dimension. So there's a lot of discussion about partnerships between urban and rural to make sure that there's an equal footing, that the negotiations are not too biased towards the urban. So there's a need to work on the vision with the urban agenda as well. Then of course there's a lot of discussion about rural to rural linkages, and here we all know that rural lack a scale effect. So there's a lot of discussion around intermediary bodies such as brokers, hubs, and the importance of social innovation to play these rural to rural interactions and to build partnerships and cooperations, not just rural to rural, but also across borders. There's some interesting discussions. And then there's a lot of also what came out was this need for vertical types of coordination. So there's also how you do this vision between at the local, regional, national, and European scale. So finding out these partnerships across different levels of government is also important. We also heard about vibrant communities, and the vision needs to transform change, the importance of participation, these brokers as agents of change. And then we also heard that the long-term vision needs to be future ready. So there's a lot of discussion on digitalization. And here we heard about the importance of the physical aspect. If you don't have that physical digitalization, you're not going to get to the opportunities. So this is a necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition, because you also need skills and to work on how to utilize some of these benefits of digitalization. Then we heard a lot about innovation and some of the opportunities to add value in many processes. And then we heard also about the green transition and the low carbon economy, how to valorize some of these opportunities. So I think those are some common elements. Now, the question is how do we get there? Next slide, please. I think the first item that we heard is the needs to build capacity of local actors. And that's very, very important to work with building that local capacity. The second one, we heard a lot about enabling factors. So we heard a lot about there's a need to improve skills, services, reduce red tape, digital infrastructure that I mentioned before, mentoring, coaching, these kinds of issues were kind of like very rich on the discussions. There's also a need to come up with flexible tools, models of cooperation that bring simplification and embrace new economic models that can react quickly to these changes that are coming. And then there was a lot of discussion about resources around the notion of rural proofing. Well, what came out in a number of areas that we need to make sure that a lot of these sectorial policies have a rural lens to it. But also we heard about the need about resource allocation and tax schemes. And the third element was about having the governance structure to put this vision into motion and implement it. Next slide, please. Finally, we heard about the need for better data. So it's important to be able to measure things, to come up with concrete indicators, to know a little bit what the assets are, to produce this knowledge in some of these rural places. So there's a discussion about this rural observatory. And we also heard from the opening session from Doug's discussion on this as being kind of like the new commodity on data. So I think that's also quite important. But it's not just the sake of creating data. There's a need to communicate it and also put into use into this rural vision. And then finally, there was also a need to look at resilience. There's a lot of discussion about resilience and how, for example, changing preferences around quality in the food systems requires you, or like rural places, to think about specialization and diversification. So there was a lot of discussion about maybe the smart specialization might be a good way to go to build resilience while trying to specialize and diversify at the same time. There's a need to have with flexible and cooperation models, and to valorize new opportunities. So I think those are some of the elements that were mentioned around this resilience and forward-looking solutions. So that's a bit my summary of all of the sessions. Now, if I were to have a couple of reflections, next slide, please. I think, it's really important to think about the geographic scale because, we talk a lot about the diversity of rural, the needs to work with bottom-up approaches, and there's a risk that we fragment this vision too much, that we try to give a little piece to all the rural communities, but we don't really develop joint programs to come up with economies of scale. So I think it's very, very important that we think about the geography. Yes, we have a diversity of rural, but we also need to work with common agendas. And I think it's very important to let the people come together. So sometimes, the geography cannot be dictated by Brussels or by national governments, but how do people want to come together? And I think that's a good geography that we should try to work better. So that's one aspect that I think it's critical. The second one, I think the long-term vision needs to be a living document. It cannot be a vision that is elaborated and it stays as it is. It needs to be constantly revised, reflected, adapted to change. So I think I would think it's important to make this vision as a living document that involves both from the top down, of course, and also from the bottom up. So I think that's important to think about the vision. Then there's a risk that we create this very ambitious vision, but we don't give the resources. So I think we need to avoid unfunded mandates to ensure that this vision can actually be implemented. And I think here it's very important to work about how to make sure we build economies of scale. We address some of the trade-offs that we know that exist in some of these rural places where it's more expensive to provide some services. And finally, next slide, please. My last point, I think it's very important when we talk about rural proofing to go beyond that. Rural proofing is important, but that's not sufficient. Once we have all the ingredients in place, we need to cook the cake. We need to make sure that all these rural proofing have synergies, are well coordinated and adapted to the different rural places. So I think it's very important to go beyond the notion of rural proofing, but to take it around the scale and to have an overarching mechanism to do that. Then I think for the long-term vision, of course, countries are also at play. So I think it's very important to think about ways to build synergies with national policies, with regional and with local policies. Just to give you an example, the inner area strategy in Italy is a good example of how they combine EU initiatives with national ones, with different ministries. So I think we need to come with a way to think about this, how this long-term vision also fits with national and some national agendas. And my final point, I think, the important part of the vision for me, what I see is very important, it's not a vision that is reactive, but it's anticipatory. I think that's very important that we make it, that we change it around, not just having a rural policy that reacts to the state of the world, but I can think a little bit about the opportunities. And here, for example, just to give you two small points on this issue, I think it should really focus on well-being. And there's a lot of discussion about alerts when we see there's population declines or GDP decreases. I think we need to really, really see whether the lives of people are improving or getting worse, because we can also have situations where there are some shrinkages, but the quality of life is increasing. So it's also coming with a vision that is realistic, that is fit for future. And of course, digitalization is the key to the future. So I'll just leave it with that, with my comments as a starting point. Back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Enrique, for that. A lot of food for thought there provided. As I've said before, I'll open up in the chat for people to put their own questions across, but I'll kick off our discussion with this. What can be done in the short term to make rural people feel that we are really setting off on a path to a better future for rural areas?
Well, I think in the short term, it's important to listen. I think that's a necessary first step to leave national capitals and to go to the places of what this process has started. I think that's very important to first listen and understand the different realities. I think right now, the current context of COVID-19 is has accelerated a lot, this experiment about teleworking. So I think over the short term, besides listening and trying to get a sense of how things are, I think it's important to think about what to do with some of these rural areas within COVID-19. And the fact of the matter is that, the digitalization that I mentioned before, I think is going to be critical if you want to also give the same level of opportunities with teleworking to a lot of these rural communities. So I think on the short term, I would address first that emergency that we're facing now, and right around the corner we have the climate change agenda. So I think that's also important, not to lose track of the other humongous challenge that we have on how to make sure that a lot of these rural places don't not only mitigate some of the impacts, but can also think about the opportunities that might be there for them. Because I think that's an issue that it will be very, very exciting in terms of there's going to be new ways of doing things, new ways to deliver services around the climate change. There are many opportunities out there for a lot of these rural communities. So I think those would be my advice, what to do on the short term.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'm just going to pick up on that point. I'm not getting any questions in the chat, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because sometimes it's there will be some interesting surprises. But I'm going to pick up on the point about being anticipatory. It's easy for me to say, but not being reactive and having a holistic policy. Do you think there are any good examples of a policy that works like that?
Yes, we recently did a review in Japan, and Japan is one of our OECD member countries that is facing the biggest challenges in terms of the demographic challenges. They're losing population and they're aging at a very high rate. And what they have done is they in the past they tended to ignore it. They didn't like to face these challenges, but they decided to change their approach and to actually be a bit more anticipatory. So what they did is they created this long-term vision. It's called the long-term vision for spatial planning. And they put themselves in a situation of how they're going to be looking like in 2060, how the demography will, on the basis of population projections. And on the basis of that scenario, they decided to put their investments on infrastructure, on services. So I think that's a very good example. And what's interesting is when you do such a long-term vision, let's say 40 to 50 years, you need to think about how to implement it with changing governments. So I think that's also a challenge. Once you have this vision, how do you actually implement that? So I think that's a good example that resembles a little bit this long-term vision that we're trying to do on rural places. Huh?
Yeah, and as I said that I hadn't got any questions from the chat. I do now have a question in the chat that I'll relay to you if I will, which is the well-being emphasis is very good, but how do we change the dynamic to move away from wealth creation or economics to the well-being focus? How is that achievable?
Well, the first part is data and statistics, and as you know, there's a lot of work already done on measuring well-being across the OECD. We have already data at some national level. We don't have it across the rural. So of course, the different dimensions of well-being are the economic, the social, the environment. What we don't do at the OECD is we're not prescriptive of which of those elements are important, because we do see that some countries favor more the economic dimension. Other ones are more around the environmental and the social. So we could produce this very nice flower, and we kind of like let the countries themselves decide which parts of the flower are more important to them. So I think that the first critical elements to measure the state of well-being in some of these rural places, and then to define how to advance, how to come up with a vision to choose amongst all of those dimensions of well-being, which ones are the ones that we want to pursue over the short, medium, and long term. So I think that goes back to our discussion about the use of data and having a strategy and building common agendas and having clarity in terms of the policy, the indicators, and how to get there.
Okay. Another combination of something that came up earlier. It was looking at governance structures and what might be needed. And you've mentioned the Japanese government, but there's a question on governance structures and how we have flexible governance structures to make a policy happen. One of the things that came up in the earlier chat, I'm just going to relay, is the role of local action groups, for example, or local and regional policies. And someone was saying, how do we make sure that they address all rural areas? And of course, there are 2,700 of them. What's the role of these different governance structures in making this all happen?
Well, I think when you look at the governance structure in rural within a European country, you will need to deal with the local, the regional, the national, and the EU level. So I think when we're talking about building more autonomy, building a little bit, giving them more resources, I think it's about establishing new partnerships between levels of government. So I think the essence is to come up with ways to build common agendas. How can you cannot have a top-down policy approach without engaging with the communities, but you can also not have a bottom-up approach where everybody does their own thing without some common threads at the national scale. So how do you combine this top-down with the bottom-up? So I think that's the key on the governance structures to coming up with common agendas, to finding ways of working together. And here, when we talk about the strategy, it's very important to also think about strategies that are very clear, that at the local level, they know exactly what they want, what is the vision that is stated, not in a 300-page document, but something that's quite easily pursued. And they can also be measured. But I think it's important to also, when we establish these visions and these working relations, to come up with objectives, to come up with common agendas, and also I think that's I'll leave it with that.
And thank you. And I have, if you'll bear with me, I have one more question which has come through from the chat, and I think it's nicely summarized as this. Thanks to many of my colleagues for doing so. Is how do we build institutional capacity across all countries to deal with new challenges? If I can summarize it like that.
Well, unfortunately, here there's no shortcuts. It takes time. Building capacity is not something that you can just come in and do it from one day to the next. I think it's an area that building institutions, it's quite complex. There's not a single formula. The institutional structures across the EU are very different. We have federal countries, we have unitary countries, but I think a strong commitment towards capacity building has to deal with mentoring as well, to kind of like support, mentoring, coaching, teaching, but also giving resources. Because if you try to build capacity without allowing the students to walk, it's very difficult to do that. So I think it's also about decentralizing resources and making some of these subnational authorities a bit more responsible and asking more out of them. I think that's how you build capacity over time. And there's also, I think, one of the quotes from one of the sessions says that it's like a tango. You have to step on each other's foot. So it's also, I think, there's a need to work with experiments, to try things out if they work or not. We've seen that across a lot of our countries, we have asymmetric decentralization. So there's trying out new things. I mean, there's not a single formula, but it's a process that takes time. But that's I think that's worth the investment over the medium and long term, because when you have good capacity at the subnational level, there's a lot of good that can come with it.
Okay, thank you very much for that summary. A really good summary of all that we heard throughout the week, and if I may say, some lovely metaphors about how we look at the flower and how we make the cake. So thank you so much for your input, Enrique Gasalado. Plenty for us to take to put in front of the commissioners. So thank you to Enrique. And just before we bring in the commissioners, I think what we've been doing, I've been saying it before, we've been peppering this throughout the week, is videos with testimonials from across the EU showing us their rural areas. We've got one last one of those just to give us a flavour to take it into our final session.
Hi, I'm Moritz from the northern part of Germany. The main economic sector in our region is agriculture. I believe that it is important to involve the younger generation in important projects and decisions, and also listen to them. This is my rule.
Είμαι ο Παναγιώτης από την Κύπρο. Εργάζομαι στην περιοχή Ντρόοδους. Εδώ είναι η γη που καλλιέργησαν και έζησαν γενναίες πριν από εμένα. Εύχομαι μέχρι το 2040 να υλοποιηθούν οι υποδομές για αντιμετώπιση της αστιφιλίας. Αυτή είναι η ύπαιθρός μου.
I'm Christina from Offerdal in the middle of Sweden. This is my rural area with beautiful surroundings and dedicated people. In 2040, the rural wisdom and perspectives are the foundation for a truly sustainable society. This is my rural.
For us young farmers, it's important to keep touch with nature, yourself, and the environment. So whatever your role is in agriculture, be yourself and dare to stand out, dare to be different. This is my rural.
So there you go, some final testimonials showing the breadth and diversity of our rural areas across Europe. So what I want to do now is bring in the panel of the commissioners. So we've got joining us very shortly Vice President Suiza and Commissioner Ferreira. But first of all, and there they are, thank you for joining us just now. Unfortunately, we cannot be joined today by Commissioner Wojciechowski because although he's been here with us during the week and he really wanted to today, as many of you know, the negotiations in the future CAP are at a very important stage, and one of the key meetings is taking place today. So I'm going to ask all the panel for their reflections on their views and aspirations for rural areas, but we were able to catch up with Commissioner Wojciechowski earlier, and he took some time just to share with us those key views and ideas on the long-term vision.
Ladies and gentlemen, this past week we have come together to discuss the future of Europe's rural areas. You have shared your aspirations and innovative ideas. It is now up to all us to make the future of our rural areas green, digital, and successful. I had the privilege to grow up in a rural area where farmers continue to be the fabric of local communities. But I also saw the challenges. Public transport, for example, is slowly disappearing. So I was particularly pleased when President von der Leyen asked me to develop a long-term vision for rural areas. Since this Commission has taken office, we have set course to a green and digital transition in all areas of the European Union. COVID-19 has only underscored the importance of the transition. Your contribution in this is essential. The transition cannot happen without rural areas. I'm grateful that you took part in the Rural Week, and I hope that you will continue to be involved. The development and successful implementation of a long-term vision for rural areas will require all of us to work together, from the local to the European level and far beyond this Rural Week. Whether as farmers, businesses, policymakers, and or citizens, we all need to play our role to reach our common goal, an inclusive, fair, and resilient future for the European rural areas. I'd like to take a moment to thank the European Network for Rural Development and particularly the Contact Point team for the organization of this event. I hope you will agree with me that it has shown rural networking at its best. In advance of this Rural Week, a public consultation took place to gather views on the vision for rural areas. The consultation received more than 2,000 responses from all member states. Respondents said that they feel that rural areas are being left behind. They should be valued for their contributions to food security, to climate neutrality, to the preservation of nature and increased quality of life. They want equal opportunities and improve access to basic services. They also noted that agriculture is at the center of rural areas. It is clear that the challenges in rural areas are many and have expanded during the pandemic. Yet this also offers many opportunities. The pandemic has given new value to rural areas. The Commission is, of course, interested to support rural areas, address some of the challenges they face. The Recovery and Resilience Facility will be able to help them move forward on a more sustainable path. Meanwhile, negotiations on the new Common Agricultural Policy are taking shape. Both will provide funding for projects in the rural areas. The new vision touches upon all policy areas and all governance levels. This means that rural areas will be brought to the core of policy making. New and existing policies will have to take rural concerns into account and deliver maximum benefit. The long-term vision that we started shaping this week will propose concrete actions and at the same time invite engagement from member states, regions and the local level. For this we need better data. Data is essential to understand the rural dimensions of economic, social and demographic conditions. It will inform us on how policy improves these conditions. We also need consistency and coherence. There are multiple policies and funds. We need to make sure all of them pull in the same direction. They must cover all economic activities, focused on the advancement of rural areas. Together they can become more than the sum of their parts. Ultimately, people living and working in rural areas need to choose what works best for them. The long-term vision for rural areas set out tools, mechanisms and guidance for rural communities to get inspired, started, and to find their own unique path. I hope you will continue your engagement on this mission.
With thanks to those words from Commissioner Wojciechowski, I am pleased now, of course, to be joined by Commissioner Ferreira and Vice President Suica. First of all, if I can come to Commissioner Ferreira, what about your views and aspirations? And if you wish to reflect on what was just said by Enrique Garcilaso, if I may.
Yes, well, David, thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to the very interesting summary done by Enrique Garcilaso, and it is in fact a pleasure for me to participate. So I'll just say a couple of words, and then I'll be very, very interested in answering eventual questions. So, Vice President Suica, dear Dubravka, Commissioner Wojciechowski, dear Janos, ladies and gentlemen, in fact, the work that you have been doing is of very, very high quality. And here I join all the thanking of Commissioner Wojciechowski. And in fact, it was the culmination of an intense period of consultation on this long-term vision for rural areas. I thought about quoting President of the US, Dwight Eisenhower, when he said that we had two types of problems, the urgent and the important. But the urgent were not important and the important were not urgent. But in fact, today in Europe, we have the double challenge. We have both urgent and important problems to solve. So on one hand, overcoming the current health and the economic crisis and preparing a sound and sustainable recovery. And these are both urgent and are important, and it's the two sides, they must be coherent, two sides of the same coin. So we are here to think on here and now, but also need to think what comes after. So the answers we find in the coming months will shape our future for the next decade. I have always argued that the short-term answers and long-term recovery must all have a strong cohesion DNA. I have made this argument since the beginning because I truly believe it. We cannot afford an asymmetric recovery where half of Europe grows and gets out of the crisis and the other half stagnates. Building back better means preparing our countries for a twin transition, but it also means more balanced territories, avoiding concentration in a single pole of development. And when I say a single pole, it may be 2 or maybe 3, and on the big metropolitan areas. Now, more than ever, we must pay attention to the rural areas because each country is preparing its plans, programs, and strategies for future recovery. So this discussion could not be more timely. Your input and the long-term vision for the rural areas must be part of this wider conversation. Cohesion policy supports the convergence of countries and convergence of regions across Europe and inside each member state. And we tackle the economic, social, and territorial disparities between, as I just mentioned, and within member states. And rural regions have been and should remain a key area of attention. Over the last years, substantial support has already been channeled to the rural areas. The intensity of this support in terms of funding per person is systematically higher, of course, in rural areas than in other areas. That's what cohesion is there for. For the 2014-2020 programming period, just European Regional Development Fund and Cohesion Fund triggered more than 45 billion euros of investment in rural areas. However, this understates the contribution of cohesion policy to rural areas because reporting options on the location of investments are much broader than only rural and urban, but more than financial assistance. And here I go back to the summary that was made by Enrique. More than financial assistance, cohesion is an economic development tool that examines the specificities of each region, building on the assets and helping to overcome the constraints. This we must do for rural areas too. We must look at the common factors and broader trends. We must also look at the differences and specificities. A rural area, as we just saw with the testimonies and short, very interesting films from different areas of Europe. But in fact, the rural area in the Alpine region has completely different needs from a rural area in a peripheral member state. We need to offer, as far as possible, tailor-made approaches. For this, we need to build on the territorial agenda, a tool for more place-based sensitive policies. And this goes in line with also the recent work done by OECD. But we have got to acknowledge the value of rural territories for this balanced development of the Union. We need to ensure that rural areas are attractive and dynamic places where people can both live and work. This means 4 broad priorities and strands of action. First, we need to ensure that basic public services are accessible to people living in these rural areas. Services for aging people, but also for young people who want to stay or settle there and make a new and better life. And for this, I would just underline that there is in cohesion policy technical assistance that can be used to build the institutions, but also the reform and resilience plans. They allow for public administration refitting. And this is sometimes a very important element also. Second, digital connectivity is needed if we want to have digital-oriented growth. For certain services also to be accessible, from education to the access to the normal public services. So this is also crucial for those who wish to work remotely or to create and run companies from there. As workers or entrepreneurs, they will enjoy a greener environment and the better living conditions of rural areas. Under our recently adopted digital strategy for 2030, we have proposed as a target to provide very high connectivity to all households by 2025, wherever they are. But anyway, We have got to make absolutely sure that we don't create a digital divide in the new digital society. This is a very important thing. Third, good transport connections, and Commissioner Wojciechowski was remembering that the connections are vital, both to export production from these areas, but also to make them attractive as often touristic destinations, for instance. Fourth, development must be combined with sustainability, notably the preservation and upgrading of landscapes and of natural assets and resources of rural areas. We want prosperous rural areas by promoting greenery, agriculture, and preserving natural resources. But we also want prosperous rural areas by encouraging new economic activities and growth sectors in innovation, digitalization, in the green and circular economy. For instance, traditional activities such as sustainable tourism or crafts could be expanded with digital assistance. So these are the common needs and opportunities. But as I mentioned before, rural areas are not all in the same situation. One size doesn't fit all. We understand that each rural region has specific assets, from economy to culture or history, from demography to climate. Any solution, any strategy must take stock of these assets. This is why in cohesion policy, we propose smart specialization strategies where local partners identify regional assets and develop them in accordance to a cooperative process. This too is why a dedicated policy objective of the new cohesion policy named European Closer to Citizens was created to support actors and opportunities. So rural areas must use every opportunity under the European Union policies and under the European Union budget, European Regional Development Fund and European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development. We'll continue to prioritize support for rural development. But it is important to look beyond this and make sure that other policies and instruments are also spatially aware, that they take account of the needs and opportunities of these areas. In conclusion, I think the long-term future of rural areas can be bright. It will be bright, I hope. Lockdown gave us a taste of teleworking and for clean air. Both of these play in favor of rural areas and suggest new possibilities, new opportunities. To make the most of all these opportunities for each and every rural region, we need a common discussion like we are having today and framework, but also a tailor-made approach. Growing territorial awareness and growing territorial support has, for me, been a very welcome development. And it underpins our discussions today. Attractive, dynamic, and prosperous rural areas are necessary for the EU to develop harmoniously, and all is both important and urgent. And I am convinced that by working together, we will do it. We will make it possible. Thank you once again for having me on this discussion.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for those very interesting words. There's lots that I've taken on board from what you've said, and perhaps we'll come back to some of those points and if there are any questions. But thank you for now. If I can then pass to Vice President Suica. I admire that your Commissioner Ferreira has much better pronunciation. I apologize if I've mispronounced it all. But for your views and aspirations and any other reflections you might have.
Thank you, David. Your English pronunciation is perfect. So thank you. When I was listening now to Janusz and Elisa, my dear colleagues, I thought they said everything. So they are really experts in this field. So if I may reflect a little bit, 4 days ago on Monday, it was with great pleasure that I opened this European Rural Vision Week with two of my colleagues, as I said, with Janusz and with the Portuguese Minister Maria de Seu Antunes on behalf of Portuguese presidency. I'm also, if I may say, delighted to also join you at the end of your deliberations to conclude this event. And I was, now when I watched this short video, and when I was listening to my colleagues, I really enjoyed what young farmers can do, how farming important it is, and how rural areas attractive can be. So I have been following your proceedings, and I sincerely believe that this week has been a success. So I think it has been a very concrete realization of what I always say, that there is an incredible potential in listening to and discussing with different rural stakeholders. So this week was also an opportunity to show that solutions for the future of rural areas should come from rural areas themselves. So we don't talk about them without them. So we think that it is very important that the number of people who took part in public consultations is also very important. And I'm glad that the discussions you had and the solutions you came forward with were very fruitful, very rich, and that the variety of the participants was so large and so inclusive. You know that I have been a mayor myself of a relatively small city by its size, but a very big one when it comes to its history, its potential, and its outreach. And I'm therefore also personally very much aware of the challenges and the opportunities that local actors meet every day. And it is with them in mind and on the basis of the green, digital, and demographic transitions that this Commission has embarked on a mission to ensure a better future for our rural areas. I think that this long-term vision that we will adopt in June will not be built by technocrats or experts. It is, of course, also with them. It is being made by listening to your concerns, to your ideas for change. You, the citizens, the young, the old, the families, the farmers, the artisans, the innovators, the businesses, the associations, the locally elected, you that together form the precious communities of rural areas. We are now entering into the concrete drafting phase of our vision, and the text will certainly be enriched by all the discussions you have had this week. This vision will be underpinned by an action plan, which I think will enable us to continue to listen carefully to your expectations, because the adoption in June will only be a starting point, the starting point of a very new approach towards rural areas. Of course, this is only for introduction. I'll be now happy to answer your questions.
President Šuica. I do have some questions. Actually, the first question I'm going to have was one we were able to put to Commissioner Wojciechowski earlier. As we mentioned, he couldn't take this question live, but he did take the time to reply to this question, which is, in our turbulent times, it's very difficult for all of us to imagine what the situation will be in 2040. But what can be done in the short term to make rural people feel that we're really setting off on the path to a better future for rural areas? And we have a video response from him.
First, I think it is important that we define together where we want our rural areas to be in 2040. A clear vision will give us objectives and focus and demonstrate that we are on the path to a better future for rural areas. We can learn from and build upon policies already in place. For instance, the Common Agriculture Policy has been supporting locally based approaches to rural development for many years now. Cohesion policy has contributed to infrastructure projects across the European Union. The Social Fund will continue to invest in the creation and protection of job opportunities. But we have to do more to keep our rural areas vibrant. We can leverage the opportunities offered by the Green Deal and the new Common Agriculture Policy. In addition, the pandemic has brought a new focus on rural areas, and we should build upon the opportunities arising from the renewed interest in rural areas. National and regional authorities should seize these opportunities to invest in rural territories. The CAP national strategic plans and the recovery plan are both excellent vehicles for this. And we have to do it together, both in the short and in the long run. This Rural Weeks has demonstrated how many people are involved with the future of rural areas. It is a clear sign of our shared commitment to a better future for rural areas.
With thanks to Commissioner Wojciechowski for taking the time to respond earlier to that question. I'd then like to turn to Commissioner Ferreira once more, who was very clear on the absolute diversity of rural areas in her opening remarks. How do we capture those huge differences in rural areas and in a single European policy? That's the question I'd like to, if I may, put to you, Commissioner Ferreira.
Well, the answer is simple. We have got to go to the ground. We have got to understand that all the different, when you talk about rural areas, you have rural areas that are quite developed, and there are those that, for instance, they have an urban center on which you can really diffuse and supply all the citizens with very adequate public services in terms of education or of culture, of information, of where you can live very, very nicely and very easily. You have other rural areas that are really going through very, very difficult challenges in terms of keeping some life in there. And so you have got to really take a look, a very close look at the different situations and understand that often you have to have an urban center of at least of a small dimension and really understand how the two things combine, the surrounding area and the nucleus where you can really concentrate important services. Without access to a minimum quality of life, it's impossible to retain people there, and in particular to retain young people and to retain even more digitally based way of functioning and of developing your economy. The second aspect I would like to underline is something that sometimes we are not aware of is in fact how horizontal policies impact differently the different territories of a country or of the European Union. And so you have got to be aware of the spatial impacts of these horizontal policies, be it transport, be it industrial policy, be it the policies to support or non-support of craftsmanship, and be it the agriculture policy. Lastly, I think it's important that we have integrated territorial development strategies that really understand how a region functions, and that really is able to understand what are the blocking elements, what is the vision for the future, and how you can use then the different available instruments. And we are in an historical moment with the amount of instruments that we have available. But of course, there is no good wind for a sailor that doesn't know in which port it wants to arrive. And so this kind of work has got to be done at the multi-level with the full participation of the local people, because they are the energy on which we can build the future.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Ferreira. And yeah, and although there's not a concrete question in the chat, I believe, related to that, people are talking about how we build things up through local development. If I can then turn to Vice President Suica, what can we then do to strengthen the advantages of living and working in rural areas that the pandemic has exposed? So COVID-19 has exposed this advantage. What do we do to strengthen that?
Thank you for this question. The point you raise in this question is critically important because it addresses the very concept of attractiveness of rural areas. So I will start by taking just one example of how our rural areas can be made more attractive: the digital transition. It has been discussed a great deal during this week, and rightly so, because the digital divide is a major concern for rural areas. So this is especially true for young people, for innovators, for businesses, and for city dwellers who wish to move to rural areas, especially in the light of the very difficult COVID-19 experiences. Our ambition, as you know, is to cover all rural areas with broadband by 2025, while with the recently adopted Digital Compass, it is our goal to have 5G coverage in all populated areas by 2030. Our long-term vision for rural areas goes all the way to 2040, and it is my hope to be able to cover even the non-populated parts by then, so that new life becomes possible, even where today it's not envisaged thanks to digital transition. I heard what my colleague Elisa said, that it's hard to retain people in the areas where there are no services. But I think with this digital transition, we can change a lot. There is another example. It's rural proofing. It is a significant part of the solution. We must not forget that the consequences of COVID-19 are also addressed at European level through the unprecedented new resources made available by through new recovery and resilience funding or Next Generation EU. So rural areas should take advantage of these recovery funds because that money is targeted at the green and digital transitions, as you know, this 20 and this 37%. And without partnership with rural areas, we may not be able to achieve our objectives. And I think this is very important when we draft these national plans, to work together from bottom up, to work together and to take rural areas and their local authorities into consideration. Otherwise, these national plans won't be successful, and we wouldn't be able to, as I said, achieve our goals, and I hope we will. So I'm positive, but just to remind.
Thank you very much, Vice President Suica. And that in part, and the follow-up questions I would have, in part reflect something that has come up in the conversation. I think there's a quite rich conversation taking place online accompanying this, which is the vision should give us a clear direction, but shouldn't decide right now that digitalization is the only solution. And I don't think you were. I think you were signalling there are other instruments and measures, and that was apparently your answer. To Commissioner Ferreira, if I may, you talked about building back better, and an appropriate level of quality of basic service has been identified in the conversations this week as a prerequisite for rural areas to be attractive places to live and work. What can the EU do to keep and help improve these minimum services in all territories, including the most remote rural areas?
Well, throughout times, cohesion policy has been providing a lot of those support, of that support. But initially, some decades ago, but in certain regions, we are still addressing this. We are talking about having an electrical grid and supply of electricity, or proper water, or sewage, or a minimum accessibility in roads. Progressively now, for you to, our demands as European citizens are nicely increasing. And so now we are talking about digital, and Dubravka just mentioned it, and our vision is that one. But we are talking also about education services. We are talking about health services. In COVID, you saw how important it is that people are not left in a nowhere. And we are talking about a minimum of cultural services. So this you cannot. You have got to have a sense and work on the ground to see where you can locate them, so that you have accessibility without having this splitting of infrastructures all over the place and then being useless because this requires a lot of concrete work, of detailed work. But we have this opportunity. I also mentioned the access to public normal services. So if you want to renew your citizen's identity card, things like that, if you do it digitally, you need to have access to the digital infrastructure, but you also have to make sure if you are, in certain regions, that in fact you have the sufficient support to be able to use it. Because if you have places still in Europe where people don't have these capabilities and this digital, easiness, it will be complex. So that's when I'm talking about divide. So what I really think is that we have got at this moment in the recovery and resilience plans, we can solve some of these problems, and it is also important that these plans that for the first time they can support reforms. So you can reform the public administration, you can reform the education system, you can reform a lot of things and have a financial support to the investments that go along with it, that we are not territorially blind when we do it. And then you also have the multi-annual financial framework between 21 and 27 that is being negotiated at this moment between the Commission and the member states. And you also had REACT, that was a cohesion policy, with a transition coming from the emergency situation into a more normal kind of support to development and not only to emergency. And you had this speedy emergency possibility to reallocate the remaining funds in your national envelopes in order to support health investment or expenditure, support small and medium companies, support jobs. And so we are in this transition, and it is very important that when we look forward, that we learn from our past and that we don't do a recovery that is in fact based on the opposite of what we are saying. We want to leave no one behind. This includes a lot of work and practical implementation of this principle. And that includes necessarily rural areas, but we have got, and here I go back to your summary, there is a lot of substance and it is very, very rich, the kind of discussion that we had before. Now we just have to make it happen.
Okay, thank you very much, Commissioner Ferreira. A call to action. If I may, a last question. We've got lots of rich and diverse elements in the chat, and we're observing and recording all of those. But for Vice President Suica, demographic change is one of the defining factors of rural areas. How can the EU give hope to the declining parts of Europe? And what policies are needed for the growing areas?
First of all, I would like to mention that this is the first commission ever which dedicated one portfolio to demography and democracy. So demography, we are completely aware of the situation of the demographic situation in Europe, which is aging continent. But when we think about rural areas, then I will have to quote President von der Leyen, who often says, Europe wouldn't be whole without its countryside. So that's it. And I cannot agree more. For that, we must ensure that the traditions and culture of rural communities are respected and fostered. But to make sure they can be transmitted to our children also after us. But for that, we need to make sure that demographic change does not alter our rural areas until it is too late. Too late because too much population or youth have been lost, or because the crucial rural characteristics have been diminished. These issues have been discussed at length during this week, and local communities of rural areas who know these problems best are also best placed to know which specific solutions can work. So as I already said in my previous answers, we first need to listen to those local ideas because the situation is so diverse. As Elisa said, in Europe, there is no unique, no one-size-fits-all solutions. There are completely diverse rural situations and rural areas. What we heard this week is that to stay alive, attractive, and to thrive, rural communities need to improve their inclusiveness and that they need to be vibrant in a way that is always respectful of the environment. This is also important. So this should be easier for rural communities because they live more closely with their environment. And green local solutions need nevertheless to be explored, financed, and shared. And we as European Union can help in that regard. Local communities also need to be inclusive and to take special care of their youth and their elderly. When I mention youth and elderly, then I want to mention part of my portfolio, which is aging. Aging is very important. And as we say, we start aging from the moment we are born. And now I have to refer to this, what Elisa said earlier. So we have to teach not only young, but our older people in rural areas to use these digitals, to make these digitals useful for them. So lifelong learning comes also here. So we have to take this into consideration and try to improve digital literacy. So this is everything is overlapping, and we have to look at this in a very, very comprehensive way. So this means that we have to make sure that integration of new members of community is also done in a respectful and intelligent manner. That means to give everyone the best opportunities European Union can offer, from international exchanges to celebrating local innovations. This also means to ensure that public and private services are not out of reach and that they are actually helpful, and to make sure that those ideas are not just words but can be transformed into concrete form. As Elisa said, make it happen. So we will pay extra attention to the follow-up actions of the long-term vision for rural areas, and that is our ambition. This long-term vision needs to create a new momentum, as we all of us agree, for rural areas, by making our rural actors an integral part of the future of Europe, by giving them a stronger voice in Europe, by bringing them new opportunities to take advantage of the many changes that Europe is going through. This is what I will certainly do through the conference on the future of Europe. So we have to include each and every strata of our society, and the rural component will be very important. As you know, this week, last week on 10th of March, we started this conference. We signed the joint declaration. We had first executive board, and we are now trying to see how the composition of these plenaries and these different panels will look like. And I'm sure that we will include also the population and inhabitants from rural areas in order to make closer this urban-rural divide. So that is the answer to your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Vice President Suica. And I'm going to come back to you just a few minutes just to ask if you'll maybe make some closing remarks. But first of all, with thanks for earlier his contribution, Commissioner Wojciechowski, thank you to Commissioner Ferreira, and thank you to Vice President Suica for all their responses, thoughts and perspectives in this panel session. But we want to reflect for a moment on everything that's brought us to this point. So let's just have a look back at Rural Vision Week and how it's all played out. This is a week-long conversation like no other.
In 2040, rural areas will be extremely modern, and we will be able to support ourselves even if global crisis.
I believe that by 2040, we will have many more young farmers because we are the future.
In 2040, biodiversity management will already have been a profitable part of my farm business plans for years.
In 2040, the rural wisdom and perspectives are the foundation for a truly sustainable society.
We have a very clear vision. It's not an easy one, but we would like to see the possibility of living in a rural area without the need to own a car.
It's the rural communities that are the early winners of the green transition.
It is important to think in long-term vision, that we do not make myopic decisions now that will affect the further generations later.
In the category popular vote, the winner is Angelic Gardens, Anielskie Ogrody, Poland, Polska. Congratulations. Gratuluję serdecznie.
Greetings to everyone from Angelic Gardens. We believe that a green future is possible. We are part of nature. The action of each of us have an influence of the future of all people. Thank you.
We have plenty of opportunities in rural area to participate to this green transition, and I think we have to unlock the potential of rural area.
The development and successful implementation of a long-term vision for rural areas will require all of us to work together.
Our vision looks to fair, green, innovative, and altogether sustainable development for resilient and connected rural areas and communities.
So there you have the summary of the week. I'd now just like to pass over to Vice President Suica and ask her if she'd make some closing remarks for this Rural Vision Week.
Thank you, David. I will not take too much more time. I think that everything has been said and that time has come now to sit down and draft this vision for the benefit of all of us, for the sake of our partnership and to make our joint future a better one. This week, we have heard that this long-term vision for rural areas was very much awaited in many communities because the situation in some places is truly difficult. We also heard that this vision needed to be concrete and not only ink on paper. I cannot agree more. We will make this vision operational and concrete, equip it with an action plan, with rolling projects, with tangible initiatives. And we will measure the progress and report back on it. We will not disappoint you because we want to make sure that we do not disappoint ourselves. What we heard this week was that rural areas needed more inclusive and horizontal governance to pay attention to small but significant projects, which could be leaders or examples in their field. We need to make sure that our initiatives respond to the needs and expectations of our rural citizens, that we tackle the very specific mobility issues of rural areas, especially in sparsely populated regions and regions facing problems of population decline. Or again, for the adaptation of public and private services in rapidly aging rural communities. We will make sure that in everything we do, we leave no one behind. We also heard this week a lot about bottom-up initiatives, exchanging good practices, being more inclusive, more green, celebrating local heroes, and making a special place for young people. I think this is inherently what the European Union is all about, exchanging ideas, best practices, and thriving to be a better place for everyone economically, socially, and environmentally. But by taking into account the challenges of the future and responding to them in a responsible, fair, and democratic manner, what is also very important. These problems were clearly pointed out in your contributions, in your different contributions during this very interesting and stimulating Rural Week. We have heard what you have to say, and it is with these things in mind that we will elaborate and present our long-term vision for rural areas in June. Thank you very much and see you soon.
Thank you very much, Vice President Suica, for those inspiring words. So that just leaves it to me to say thank you for all your contributions throughout this week. Thank you for everyone for taking part. We've captured all of that so far. We continue to capture that, including the chat from today. So my thanks go to everyone that's participated, from the opening on Monday, right through all the 8 workshops, the Fringe, the Marketplace, those people that took place, those inspiring projects that we saw in the Rural Inspiration Awards yesterday with over 10,000 votes coming in for the popular vote. You've all been part of that. I think it's been very clear from the messages you've heard from the European Commission that all your perspectives, all the things that you've put forward are being taken into account, and that what will be created will be an inclusive and wide-ranging document. But of course, the action, as we've mentioned during the week, doesn't just come from the European Commission. It comes from all the levels going down the way, and it can be bottom up too, because we all need to work together to make this happen, because after all, this is our rural. Thank you.